In two back-to-back hearings before Congress, Robert Mueller stuck to his word that the 448-page report he delivered weeks ago was his testimony.
I'm just going to refer you to the report, if I could. I refer to the report on that episode. I'm not going to get into that at this juncture. I'm not going to get into that.
But one thing he did get into was his decision not to make a decision about whether Donald Trump obstructed justice.
We needed to go forward only after taking into account the OLC opinion that indicated that a president, a sitting president, cannot be indicted.
So the report did not conclude that he did not commit obstruction of justice. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And what about total exoneration? Did you actually totally exonerate the president?
No.
That was the main takeaway for many Democrats, and while a few others scored points by highlighting the different ways Mueller's report found the president tried to undermine the investigation, Republicans scored plenty too, going hard at Mueller and questioning the legitimacy of the investigation itself.
Donald Trump is not above the law. He's not. But he damn sure shouldn't be below the law, which is where Volume 2 of this report puts him. Can you give me an example other than Donald Trump where the Justice Department determined that an investigated person was not exonerated because their innocence was not conclusively determined?
I cannot, but this is a unique situation.
Well,
So more than 5 hours later, was the needle moved in either direction? Joining me are Nancy Gertner, retired federal judge, senior lecturer at Harvard Law. Good to see you, Judge Gertner. Thanks for being here.
Good to be here.
Former Massachusetts U.S. Attorney Don Stern, who worked alongside Robert Mueller both during his stint with the Department of Justice and in private practice at Hale and Dorr. Good to see you. And I should say you know Mueller quite well.
I do.
Too, from his Boston days. Did we learn anything today that we didn't know before this morning at 8:30?
No. I don't think so. I mean, I think that if anyone was actually paying attention to the hearing, the questions were telling the narrative of the report.
Like Jerry Nadler's questions were good at the beginning. Like
Nadler's questions and Schiff's questions were telling the narrative. But you had to watch the whole thing, and it was very difficult to follow.
Did you learn anything that we didn't know from the 448
not really.
pages?
It was disappointing because I thought that Bob Mueller could stay true to what he wanted to do, which is to stay within the four corners, the boundaries of the report, but serve a public service, an educational function of describing it at least in more digestible terms.
I'm so glad you said that. So where to begin? One of the things that put me totally over the edge today is Margie and I doing a radio show, and during the testimony I'm saying, well, I'll give you an example. Preet Bharara was here a couple of months ago, and he said, even if he stays within the confines of the report, when he, in his own words, reads the obstruction of justice examples, it gives it life. And so after about an hour, I'm saying to Mark, why is he not reading? And then we find out from the New York Times he cut a deal with the Democrats on the committee that he would not read anything. What kind of witness before Congress has the right to say, if asked to read from my own report when he says the report is my testimony, has the power to not do that? I was stunned.
Well, it's like, it reminded me, as a trial lawyer, as an old trial lawyer, it's like having witnesses testify without an opening statement or a closing argument. You know what I mean? It was just the facts floating out there, unmoored from anything else, and no one linking it together except the partisans on
exactly,
either side.
And out of the mouths of a partisan.
That's right.
But what about this thing? I mean,
I agree.
He's a subpoenaed witness.
I don't think it would have made for compelling testimony or television, but I also think, Jim, that there were opportunities, I was hoping there were opportunities where he could have essentially been more alive. For example, when his staff was attacked and they try to undermine the staff, they're Democrats, they contributed to Hillary, etc.
Well, he did a half-assed defense.
I know,
but saying I never asked
I think it was a teaching
party.
moment where he could have said not only to the committee but to the American people,
That's right.
Listen,
could have been a moment of indignation.
prosecutors don't ask those questions. We assume and we know that it's a level playing field, and he didn't do that. It was kind of like
or when he was asked about WikiLeaks,
right.
Is there something troubling about Trump saying WikiLeaks, I love you?
Yeah.
And he said, essentially, yes, it was troubling, but wasn't going to.
Well, that's about as emphatic as he got. Well,
Yeah.
as an example of where he could have done more and stayed within at least the confines of what he said, he was asked a question by Representative Madeline Dean from Pennsylvania about something that he said at the end of the letter that he sent to Barr, suggesting that Barr's summary was confusing the public. Here's what Dean had to say, and here's Mueller's response.
You finished that letter by saying there is now public confusion about critical aspects as a result of our investigation. Could you tell us specifically some of the public confusion you identified?
Not generally. Again, I go back to the letter, and the letter speaks for itself.
The letter doesn't speak for itself at
exactly,
all.
that's exactly right.
It's fine to say, I'm not going to tell you. It's not fine. But it doesn't speak for itself. And are we not entitled, when the taxpayers spend millions of dollars on arguably the most important investigation of at least the last decade, for him to explain what he's talking about?
I think that he's already someone who wants to stay in his lane. He never gets indignant. He wants to stay in his lane. He thought that his integrity and his legitimacy would come from, a report that was really just the facts, man, and nothing more. He didn't understand how incredibly hyper-partisan this is. He didn't understand that Barr was going to hit him in the face with a 2x4.
So he figured it out. He found it
Right.
out. He was asked today, please tell us.
But he's even now wanting to, in order to answer that question, he had to trash Barr. And he wasn't going to get into that. That is not who he is. And, he felt uncomfortable doing it.
Speaking of uncomfortable, I'm uncomfortable saying what I'm saying, but I will say it. You two know the man. I've never met him. I've seen him before, maybe a half dozen of the 89 times he's testified in front of Congress. He was slow. He seemed distracted at times, unable to follow the questions. The New York Times said it was hard to hear some of the questions, so give that to him. But as someone who knows him and has known him, and I'll go to you in a second, what was your impression of the man?
Yeah, I mean, it was not his best performance. He was not on top of his game. But I'll tell you one thing. This is it reminded me a little bit of the Kennedy-Nixon debates. I listened to a good portion of it on radio because I was in my car, and it felt different than when I saw some of it on TV. I think some of the affect, some of the hesitation didn't come across quite so much if you were to read the bare transcript or if you listen to it on radio.
For those who didn't live through Nixon-Kennedy, people who watch on TV said Kennedy won, and those who listened on radio arguably said that
But no question, it was disappointing. It was not on top
what was
of
your
his game.
reaction?
Totally different than the man that I know. Totally different than the man
So
that I know.
it's just this wear and tear, or I know we're not doctors.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, his voice was shaky. He had trouble following who was doing the questioning. It's not unreasonable to be, befuddled after a 448-page report, but he didn't seem to be on top of the facts either.
The one question I think a lot of people understood that he would not answer, even though it's the question that I think all of America most wanted him to answer, and he didn't, was had it not been for the Office of Legal Counsel memo, which prohibits the indictment of a sitting president, would you have indicted the president? You, former U.S. attorney, considering that there's not another case like this, should an exception for that hypothetical have been made in this circumstance?
Well, I was disappointed in that portion of the report because I thought there was an opportunity for him to say the facts permit and we could have indicted the president, but we're not going to and we can't because of the OLC.
We could have or would have?
Well, either one. We could have, would have, but we're not going to.
Well, that's a big difference.
Well, the facts were sufficient. We could prove beyond a reasonable doubt, based upon the facts that we've learned and discovered.
You think he could have done that?
Yes.
And do you as well?
I think he could. And people have forgotten. I actually wrote a piece about this. There have been numbers of times, for example, when police officers have shot someone and the DOJ has declined. And in saying we declined to prosecute, they've described the evidence on both sides. The notion that when you decline to prosecute, you never say anything else is simply not true in every case. And with a president, it was clear in the report that what Mueller was saying is, whatever my constraints are, it's for the political branches now. But then that means it's incumbent on him to describe what the hell he's doing.
I want to make sure we're talking about the same thing. He was asked the question, I can't remember which of the Congress people it was today on the Republican side. I've never heard of a situation, nor does the Department of Justice rules, or whatever the word is, say that if you're not going to indict, you make a comment on whether or not you're exonerating someone.
Yeah, actually, that's not true.
But he said he couldn't come up with one example.
He couldn't come up with it, but
you
I can.
What is the circumstance in which it's appropriate?
I think there was something around Elian Gonzalez, I think, the
little boy
the little
from
boy
Cuba,
in Cuba. In other words, such high public interest, high-profile cases where the Department of Justice wants to explain why it didn't prosecute, and they can do it.
I'm smiling at you because your friend Hillary Clinton might argue that hers was a case where they may have.
That's right.
But
that's right.
Done that.
That's right.
And I thought one of the Republicans on the committee had a point, which is he reached an opinion and he reached a conclusion with respect to Part 1, which is whether there was a conspiracy, and decided to hold off and not even decide whether to decide.
So if you were talking to your old buddy Mueller in private about that, what would his honest answer be to that? I couldn't figure
his honest answer about whether he would have.
But why he could essentially come to a conclusion?
Because you see, listen, the guy gets into office and he knows the president is going to pull the plug on him at any moment, the minute he is appointed. And he was going to basically stay in lane. He was going to be cautious about what he did at every step.
That doesn't speak well for him, does it?
Well, I mean, I think he understood the politics at this point, so he wasn't going to go after the kids. He wasn't going to go after financial issues. And with respect to this, he did all but say the guy was guilty of obstruction of justice.
But he didn't say it.
He specifically
but
didn't say
all but,
that.
If you're as a former judge, all but doesn't count, does it?
Right.
This is not horseshoes, as they say.
Well, no, but he says all but, and then he says very explicitly in the report, in Muellerese explicitly, that this is for the political branches. He says there are 10 instances of obstruction of justice.
Well, and by the way, when he's asked by Representative Escobar about what did you mean when you talk about other constitutional things, he won't explain that either.
Yeah.
So all of us have to take a course with you to figure out what that. One last thing that I don't know if it was in the report, I can't remember. The whole notion of can he be prosecuted when he leaves office, he said emphatically yes. But the thing that was missing, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, unless the statute of limitations is run.
Right.
And a lot of people say with a smirk, one of the reasons Donald Trump wants to be a two-term president is so statutes of limitations do run. They would, right?
But there's also, there was other stuff that Mueller didn't go into. All the interference with the election, that is to say the acceptance of foreign aid in an election,
Well, he was pretty strong about how dangerous and how...
He is, but that also was a crime. In other words, there were even criminal theories that he didn't indulge because he was going to be incredibly down the line. There was nothing speculative in that report.
We only have 45 seconds left. Very quickly, any hope out of today for those who were looking for grist for the impeachment mill, or is it
probably not? I think it's a missed opportunity. In one respect, which we haven't talked about, the Russian investigation is really critical. Bob Mueller was very animated about that. He believes it's a threat to our democracy, and I almost wish that they had begun with that part of the hearing first. Intelligence first and obstruction second.
Any advance on the impeachment front, or it just stays
no,
exactly
unless
where
the
it is?
president tweets something even more bizarre than his usual tweets.
Beautifully put. Dunstan, it's nice to see you. Judge Gertner, pleasure, as always.